I understand perfectly. I will rewrite the script while strictly preserving the original structure, sentence-by-sentence arrangement, philosophical pacing, and that specific existential yet clinical tone. I will ensure the meaning, impact, and intellectual weight remain identical, but with entirely fresh wording. I will also ensure the content remains compliant with YouTube's policies by focusing on the theoretical physics of space-time and relativity, rather than promoting harmful ideologies. Here is a rewritten script in one continuous block as requested asterisk. Physicists possess a realization regarding the instant of your passing that almost no one outside of science faculty has ever been briefed on. This isn't mere speculation. It isn't a spiritual conviction. It is embedded within the very same formulas that guide satellites into orbit and unlock the power of the atom. And once this concept clicks, the barrier you spent your entire existence imagining between being alive and being gone stops look like a barrier at all. The premise is this. The distinct line you envision between existence and non-existence might not function the way you assume. Not because your awareness migrates elsewhere. Not because the spirit is waiting behind some cosmic veil, but because the very foundation that line relies on, a single, synchronized universal now sweeping across the cosmos simultaneously, might be a total illusion. If that is the case, then the moment you spend your whole life visualizing is an absolute cliff, a dividing wall between being and nothingness, isn't the type of edge that physics actually recognizes. What science describes instead is weirder, colder in certain respects, and in other ways far less definitive than anything faith or instinct ever promise you. This isn't a presentation about optimism, nor is it a presentation about dread. It is a look at what happens when you take a premise you've never once questioned. The idea that now is a fundamental property of the universe rather than property of your own perception, and you follow it exactly as far as the math permits. Because once you see the destination, the question, what happens when you die, ceases to be the correct question. The real question is far stranger, and it is one that has never been fully resolved. Most people spend their entire lives without noticing that the word now is doing any heavy lifting philosophically. It feels like the most neutral term in our vocabulary, a simple marker, a placeholder, nothing more. But every fear humanity has ever harbored about death is quietly constructed upon it. That fear assumes a solitary, universal present moment gliding forward through space, carry you along until the second it simply stops transporting you and carries on without you. Remove the assumption of one shared universal present, and you have to ask what exactly is doing the gliding, and what moving on without you could even signify in a cosmos where on and without don't point to the fixed coordinates you assumed they did. Prior to relativity, scientists envisioned a universe the way almost everyone still does subconsciously, one massive stage with a single clock ticking above it, the same time for everyone, everywhere, regardless of how fast you're traveling or where in the void you happen to be standing. Time was the backdrop. Space was a canvas. Everything else shifted through them, but the stage itself remained frozen. Then came a series of experiments that refused to fit that narrative. Physicists measure the velocity of light from every conceivable angle, expecting it to fluctuate based on the speed of the observer. The same way a ball tossed from a moving train seems faster to a bystander than to someone running alongside it. Light didn't play along. No matter how fast you raced toward it or fled from it, light arrived at the exact same speed every single time. That one stubborn, repeatable fact shattered the old model of time completely. Because if the speed of light was immutable, something else had to break. The correction wasn't minor, and it wasn't optional. Once the data was undeniable, it meant abandoning the notion of one shared now for the entire cosmos. In its place emerged something far more alien. Your now and someone else's now, especially if that person is moving differently than you or is positioned far enough away, are not automatically the same instant. They cannot simply be aligned on a single, shared timeline as you assume. Every observer, depending on their motion, carries their own version of the present, tilted at a slightly different angle through space-time. None of those versions is more authentic than any other. There is no umpire. There is no master clock hidden in the universe that resolves the conflict. Read that carefully, because it is the bedrock that everything else in this discussion rests upon. The present moment you are experiencing right this second, reading these words, is not the same present moment as someone else's. Even if you are both fully alive right now, each in your own frame of reference, each one is equally valid. This isn't a rounding error or a flaw in measurement, waiting for better technology to fix. It's not like disagreeing over the exact time on two slightly out-of-sync watches where a true time exists and one watch is simply wrong. There is no true time hiding behind the discrepancy. The discrepancy is the true description. Two valid observers, doing everything correctly, will describe the same set of events happening in different sequences. And physics has no mechanism, none at all, for declaring one the real version and the other mistake. Here is a way to feel this instead of just hearing it. Imagine a long train gliding at a constant speed, and imagine two bolts of lightning hitting the tracks, one near the front of the train, one near the back, at exactly the same instant. To someone standing still on the platform outside, from that observer perspective, both strikes happen simultaneously. Simple. No paradox yet. Now imagine a passenger sitting exactly in the center of that moving train. Because the train is racing toward the light coming from the front strike, and away from the light coming from the back strike, the light from the front reaches the passenger a fraction of a second before the light from the back does. To the passenger, the front lightning strike happened first, not because their senses are deceiving them, not because they calculated anything incorrectly, but because physically, in their frame of reference, it did happen first. Two observers, two completely different, physically valid answers to the question, which happened first. Neither of them is incorrect. There is no deeper truth hiding underneath that would settle the dispute in favor of one of them, because the disagreement is an illusion caused by the time it takes light to travel to their eyes. That has already been accounted for. The disagreement is baked into the actual geometry of space-time itself. This is what physicists refer to as a relativity of simultaneity. And it isn't some fringe theory or an interpretation open to debate. It is one of the most repeatedly verified results in the history of experimental science, confirmed in particle colliders, with atomic clocks flown on jets, and in the satellites orbiting above your head right now, correcting for this exact effect, so your GPS doesn't drift by miles. The universe genuinely does not agree on a single now. It never has. It's worth pausing and consider how commonplace this effect actually is, because it's easy to dismiss it as an exotic edge case that only matters near light speed. It doesn't. It is happening constantly, at every scale, for every moving object, including you right now, sitting still relative to the room around you, but hurtling through the void at staggering speeds relative to almost everything else in existence. The disagreements about now between you and a distant galaxy are almost certainly measured in years, not fractions a second. Somewhere beyond the horizon of what you can currently see, events you call the future may already be someone else's settled, ordinary past. If now isn't universal, then before and after aren't nearly as rigid as they feel either, at least not in the way your intuition assumes. Physicists have a name for the vision of reality. This leads to once you follow the math to its conclusion. They call it the block universe. In this perspective, the past, present, and future don't emerge and then vanish, one replacing the next like frames of film being incinerated after they play. Instead, all of it, every second, every event, every now there's ever been anyone's now, exists as a fixed, equally real region of a four-dimensional structure. Think of it less like a river flowing past you and more like a landscape, one you happen to be traversing at a set rate, experiencing one slice at a time. The way a train window reveals one section of scenery after another, even though the entire landscape exists all at once, whether or not you are currently looking at it. Under this model, your 10th birthday isn't gone the way a burned letter is gone. It is a region of the block that you are simply no longer located at. And the moment everyone defines as death isn't the universe reaching in and deleting a person. It's a boundary, a specific coordinate in the structure where one particular thread of experience stops extending forward into new regions of the block. That distinction sounds minor. It isn't. It's the difference between a candle being snuffed out and a hallway simply coming to an end. One implies erasure. The other implies a stopping point inside something that continues to exist structurally regardless. This is often termed eternalism, and it stands in direct opposition to the view most people hold without ever naming it. Presentism, the belief that only the now is real, that the past has ceased to exist, and the future hasn't happened yet. Presentism feels intuitive. It matches every instinct you've ever had. It is also the view that relativity makes almost impossible to maintain consistently because it requires a single privileged now shared by the entire cosmos. Precisely the thing the previous section showed does not exist. That doesn't make eternalism comfortable. It makes it a model that survives contact with the evidence, whether or not it happens to be comforting. So dwell on that for a moment, because this is where the idea stops being an abstract physics lecture and starts pointing directly at you. If the block universe picture is even approximately accurate, and right now it is one of the most widely discussed interpretations among physicists who take relativity seriously, then every moment you have ever lived is still there, not remembered, not stored as data in some cosmic archive waiting to be replayed, but physically present in exactly the sense that present means anything at all within this framework. The same way a city you can't currently see is still there right now, still standing, whether or not you happen to be looking in its direction. This doesn't hand you an afterlife. No one is claiming there's a version of you still walking around at your 10th birthday, waiting for a knock at the door. It means the event itself, the specific arrangement of matter and moment that constituted that instant, never stopped being a real part of the universe's architecture. It isn't being maintained. It isn't being preserved by anyone or anything. It simply is. The way a fact of geometry simply is, independent whether anyone is currently proving it. What relativity actually threatens, if you take it seriously, isn't the idea that things end. Things clearly do end in the sense that your thread through the block has a final coordinate, a place beyond which it doesn't continue. What relativity threatens is something much more specific and far stranger, the assumption that ending automatically means disappearing. Those two concepts feel identical in everyday speech. Physics is not at all convinced they are the same thing. Physicists have a tool for mapping exactly which events can possibly influence which other events, given that light, and therefore causality itself, can only travel so fast. It's called a light cone. Picture yourself at a single point in space-time right now, and imagine two cones stretching away from you. One opening into your future, one opening into your past, like an hourglass with you sitting at the pinch point in the center. Everything inside your past light cone is an event that could, in principle, have influenced you. Everything inside your future light cone is an event you could, in principle, still influence. But there's a third region, everything outside both cones to the sides, that can never affect you and that you can never affect. Not because of distance alone, but because nothing, not even light, can bridge that gap fast enough to connect the two of you in either direction. Here's the strange part. Events sitting in that elsewhere region, the ones causally disconnected from you entirely, don't have a fixed order relative to each other. Depending on who is watching and how they are moving, one observer might see event A happen before event B. A different observer moving differently might see B happen before A. Both are correct because no cause and effect relationship links them anyway. So, the universe simply doesn't bother enforcing a single sequence between them. Causality, the actual chain of cause leading to effect, is preserved perfectly by relativity. That part never breaks. What breaks is the idea that before and after are meaningful labels for every pair of events in the universe, everywhere, all the time. They are only meaningful in the strict, unanimous sense you assume for events that can actually reach each other. Once you grasp that, before you were born and after you die, start to look less like two fixed points on a single line everyone shares and more like labels that only fully make sense from inside your own cone. Here's what makes this genuinely unsettling rather than just a technical footnote. Every event you will ever personally experience sits inside your own light cone by definition. You can only witness what could possibly reach you, which means your entire lived experience, from birth to the final moment of your thread, takes place entirely within a structure that was already guaranteed to preserve cause and effect perfectly for you. The strangeness was never inside your cone. It was always happening at the edges, in the relationships between separated observers, which is exactly why no one notices in ordinary life, and exactly why it took until the early 20th century for anyone to catch the universe doing it. Here is where most explanations of relativity stop, and it's worth understanding exactly why, because this is a part that matters most and gets skipped most often. If the past is still there in the block, structurally, in the way the last section described, then in what sense is the future not also there Relativity's mathematics doesn't give you a clean, principled way to say yes to one and no to the other. The same equations that preserve your past preserve what hasn't happened to you yet, treating both as equally real regions of a single four-dimensional structure, which means the very language you use every day. Not yet, no longer, already gone, might be describing your particular location inside that structure, not the actual shape of the structure itself. This is usually the exact point where physicists go quiet. And it isn't because the mathematics runs out or the equations stop working. Relativity is one of the most rigorously tested frameworks in the entire history of science. What runs out is something else entirely. The moment you try to translate the block universe as real into what it actually means for a person, for the specific first-person experience of being you right now, reading these words, the translation breaks down completely. Physics can tell you with enormous confidence exactly how space-time is structured down to the smallest measurable detail. It has never once told you why there's something it is like to be a particular point moving through that structure at all, why there's an experience happening here, tied to this exact location in the block, rather than nothing happening at all. That question sits entirely outside anything relativity, or any branch of physics for that matter, was ever built to answer. Anyone telling you science has closed that specific gap is telling you something the science itself has not actually shown. So here's the honest version, without smoothing over the parts that are uncomfortable to sit with. Relativity does not promise you an afterlife. It does not claim that consciousness continues or that you will experience anything at all after the specific point where your thread in the block comes to an end. It does not resolve the deepest question buried underneath all of this. The question of why there is an experience happening here in the first place, attached to this particular point in space-time rather than nothing. No one has answered that question, not with equations, not with philosophy, not with a single verified experiment anywhere ever. That is not a failure of physics. It is a boundary, and boundaries are actually informative. They tell you exactly where a tool stops being able to help you and where something else would need to take over. Relativity is extraordinarily good at telling you what space-time is shaped like. It was never designed to tell you what it's like to be a point inside it, and pretending otherwise in either direction, whether to comfort you or to unsettle you, is misusing the science to make a claim it was never built to support. What relativity does instead is quieter and in some ways stranger than a straightforward answer would have been. It takes an assumption you didn't even know you were making. That time is a river flowing in one direction, deleting everything behind it as it passes. And it shows you with hard, repeatable, experimentally verified evidence that this is not how the universe is actually constructed. The moments are not being erased as they pass behind you. They are not being manufactured out of nothing as they arrive ahead of you. They simply are, all of them, arranged in a structure your senses were never built to perceive directly, only to move through one slice at a time. It's worth being precise here, because this is exactly the kind of idea that gets stretched into something it was never meant to claim. The block universe interpretation does not prove that you survive death in any experiential sense. It does not prove reincarnation. It does not prove a soul, a spirit, or a continuation of awareness in any form. None of that follows from the mathematics. And any version of this idea that tells you otherwise has quietly smuggled in a claim relativity never made. It also doesn't prove the opposite, that consciousness is just an illusion, or that the moment of death is meaningless because the structure persists regardless. That conclusion sounds like it follows logically, but it doesn't, for the same reason the hopeful version doesn't. The entire question of what consciousness actually is and why it's tied to a physical structure at all remains completely unanswered by anything in this framework, saying the block is eternal. So don't worry about death skips over exactly the same unresolved gap as saying the block is eternal. So you must continue on some level. Both statements borrow confidence to physics doesn't actually have to land. What the block universe interpretation does prove, carefully, rigorously, and repeatedly across more than a century of experiments, is narrower and, in its own way, more interesting than either of those extremes. It proves that the specific model time most people carry around without ever examining it, one shared universal now sweeping forward, erasing the past as it goes, is not the model the universe actually runs on. That's the whole claim. It's a claim about the architecture of reality, not a claim about what happens to you personally when your thread inside that architecture reaches its final point. It's also worth noting that not every physicist agrees the block universe is the correct way to interpret relativity's mathematics. Some argue for a growing block model, where the past is fixed and real, but the future genuinely hasn't been settled yet, still open in a way the past isn't. Others defend versions of presentism that try to reconcile it with relativity through more technical maneuvers regarding reference frames. The debate is real, ongoing, and unresolved among people who understand the mathematics far better than any single video could summarize. What is not seriously disputed is the underlying observation that started all of it, that simultaneity itself, the very idea of a shared now, is relative rather than absolute. Everything else builds on that one settled foundation, which leaves you exactly where honest physics always eventually leaves you, with a boundary instead of an answer, and a genuinely open question instead of comforting or frightening conclusion. If every moment that has ever existed is still structurally present in the sense the mathematics describes, does that change anything about how the moment you're living right now should feel to you? Does a boundary that isn't an eraser still deserve to be feared the way an eraser would be? Or does the fact that physics can't answer that it can describe the shape of the container perfectly while staying completely silent about what it's like to be something inside it, tell you something important about the actual limits of what equations we're ever going to be able to give you? No one has closed that gap. Not the physicists who first worked out relativity, nor the ones spending their careers on the philosophy of time right now. Maybe it stays open forever. Maybe it's one of those questions where the honest answer is simply that the tools capable of answering it don't exist yet and possibly never will. That's not a comfortable place to leave you. It's not supposed to be. It's the actual edge of what is known, and pretending otherwise in either direction would be a smaller, tidier story than the one the evidence actually supports. There's a particular kind of discomfort in that, different from the discomfort of simply not knowing an answer. It's the discomfort of realizing the question itself might be built on a framework. Before, after, ending, continuing. That doesn't cleanly apply to whatever is actually going on underneath. You spent your entire life inside your own light cone, experiencing one slice of block at a time in an order that feels absolute because it's the only order you've ever had access to. Relativity doesn't ask you to disbelieve that experience. It asks you to notice that the experience is a fact about your particular vantage point, not necessarily a fact about the whole structure you are a vantage point inside of. Maybe none of this changes how you live the next 24 hours. Maybe it shouldn't. But it means the sharp, absolute line most people carry around their whole lives, the one separating existing from not existing, drawn as cleanly as a wall, isn't a line physics actually supports. What physics support instead is stranger than that line, and in its own way, less final. A structure where every moment appears to hold its place permanently, arranged in a shape none of us is built to step outside of and see whole, which leaves you with the only honest question physics can actually leave you with. Not whether something continues after the boundary, but whether the boundary was ever the kind of thing you thought it was to begin with.